And thank you for being here. This is Small Press Traffic's last reading for this season, and after which we're going to take a summer break and resume in the fall. And Cedar and Joanne are an inspiring example of intergenerational poetic collaboration and friendship. We're honored to end the year with Places to Go, a discussion on the life and work of Joanne Kyger by Cedar Sigo. Small Press Traffic is based in the Bay Area on the unceded land of the Ohlone people. The majority of our programs take place in Yellow Moose, San Francisco, land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. We acknowledge those who have stewarded this land for thousands of years, and we stand in solidarity with the indigenous movements in the struggle for rematriation of land and self-determination. And I'd also like to say we're almost halfway to our goal, raising $20,000 by the end of June to support next year's programs, which includes guest curators Mimi Tempest and Violet Spurlock, and a new online publishing project led by Claudia LaRocco called The Back Room. There'll be a little link in the chat if you want to learn more about that and support us. So I'm going to give a short intro, and then Cedar will give his talk, and afterward there'll be time for conversation and Q&A. And thanks for being here. I listened to the lectures while driving on Hall Road at night, having just left Steinbeck country. I listened to the lectures while packing to visit a poet friend in New York City. I listened to the lectures. In my 2021 Spotify Wrapped, an algorithmic summation of your year's top listening, my #1 podcast was Cedar Sigo's Bagley Wright lectures, which might demonstrate my compromise, a devotion to poetry or a near absolute resistance to podcasts. In Cedar's work, I measure turns of voice, the unlocking of it, voice, through fragment, collage, elegy. In his poem, Rheograph, he writes, this tangible reflection of the fissure. The fissure asks the poet to extend an arm toward dystopia, hammer out its gate, to quote, build on the field of composition with wood and wire in a public corner with syllabic intent. Cedar's poems are a spell, a hovering insistence. Bits of poetry insist on being built. Syllables float through the door. Arc the voice, cling to forms. He writes in a pseudo-Sappho poem called 6 Lines Missing, quote, I'm worried the tides may have deserted me. Lines literally flee and then uncover themselves again. The poems are a portal, a we, they're ancestral, ancient, a chronic dislocation, a heart-shaped flame, material field. The poem mouths words behind Kevin Killian's back, asks Joy Harjo, what else do you remember dreaming of? Diane DePrima turns heretic, teaching the changes. The poem entitled November 19th, 2016 for Joanne Kyger goes, poetry is the part no one sees. But of course, this is not the end. With all lights bent toward the beloved, what are poems but last rays or days left unexposed? Cedar Sigo is a poet and member of the Suquamish Tribe. His most recent books are All This Time and Guard the Mysteries, both published by Wave Books in 2021. He received a Foundation for Contemporary Arts Grants to Artists Award in 2022. He's the editor of There You Are, Interviews, Journals, and Ephemera by Joanne Kyger. He was an advisory editor with Joy Harjo on When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton Anthology of Native Nations poetry. He teaches in the Low-Residency MFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. Please welcome Cedar Sigo.
Hi everyone. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Sid, and thank you to Madeline and to Jacob. And Madeline, thank you for that beautiful introduction. I actually met Madeline previous to her work with SPT at a workshop at Naropa. And so we just initially met as poets who were very inspired by each other's work. So thank you so much for that introduction. I wanted to talk a little bit about the films that we saw. First of all, those are outtakes from Joanne Kyger's 1968 residency at a place called the Center for Experimental Television. And she received a year-long grant in 1968 to collaborate with specifically a filmmaker named Lauren Sears and a musician named Richard Feliciano. And then Joanne was the poetry element, and she actually wrote a lot of poems to be filmed. And her main project at the end of that year was something called Descartes, which is a poem that is in her book Places to Go. And that's a long film of several kind of dramatized sections. But I believe what we just saw were probably their initial projects together before Joanne figured out what she wanted her big year-long project to be. So yeah, I discovered those, and it's just nice to be able to share something, something completely hidden, something for the real Joanne Kyger fanatics. So, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, what I'll share today in terms of the text. Since 2014 or so, I've taught Joanne's work for about 8 years, but we have been friends. We met initially in 1996, and we were, very close friends pretty much since we met. So although I had been friends with her for a long time, I wasn't really trading on that relationship in a public way for a long time until I started getting paid to teach and just teaching the poets that I loved. But since her death, of course, I have written a lot about Joanne. I've presented a lot about her. I've taught her a lot. And I obviously did the Wave book, There You Are, which was ephemera and interviews. And I wrote a lecture. There's one lecture in Guard the Mysteries about Joanne, specifically when she was married to Jack Boyce and lived in New York and traveled around Europe in the late 60s. And then I wrote the intro to There You Are as well. And a lot of my writing about Joanne so far has been focused on her work and getting other people to read her work, getting other people to maybe write about her work. There have been, some anecdotes in there, but I really haven't talked too much about my personal relationship with her. And I decided to do that in this talk. Maybe because it's small press traffic and I feel like I probably know most of the people in this room, but also because I never really did share it. I never really did share what our friendship was like, and the fact that we traveled to Mexico together, and also how we were so close, but our writing couldn't be more different in terms of approach. And then she was kind of influencing the way I approached poems, but only toward the end of her life. Did I let my guard down enough to gain that influence? And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about what it's like to live without her. And if I get upset during this talk, which might happen, that's okay. It happens still. Okay, so could you show image 1, please? Sure. All right. So Joanne Kyger had been visiting Mexico regularly from about 1974 onward. And this picture here, this is the cover of All This Every Day that was published by Big Sky, which is Bill Berkson's press, I believe in 1975. But this picture includes Peter Warshall, who was her partner at the time. This was taken at a nature preserve, San Cristobal de los Casas in Chiapas. And this was her first trip to Mexico, which I double checked with Donald Gurevich, her partner. And he said there may have been trips to like Tijuana during her college years, but that was her first trip into the interior of Mexico, 1974. And after that, you know, Joanne started visiting regularly, and she would live down there. She wouldn't go for a week and a half. She would go, her minimum would be like 1 month. So she would visit for 1 to 3 month stretches, often with Donald Gurevich. They met at Naropa in 1978. And then he moved in pretty quickly after that and visited her in Bolinas. And then, and he had spent his own time wandering around Oaxaca and all these places, you know, for like 7 years previous to meeting Joanne. So I think that was part of the intensity of their meeting in 78. And my own trip to Oaxaca with Joanne and Donald and my partner, Brian, who's here next to me, that trip occurred in 2014. They suggested that we come down in celebration of my birthday, which is February 2nd, as they would be in Oaxaca for a 3-month stretch during that time. We would visit the complex of pre-Columbian pyramids at Monte Alban, and the next day go to the Museum of Oaxacan Culture housed in an old monastery to see the hammered golden objects that had been found inside the tombs of the pyramids. Monte Alban had been established by the Zapotecs in 500 BC. And I love that we broke that, you know, the pyramids into 2 days, 1 day at the site and 1 day at the museum. That seems very Joanne to me. Okay, can you show image 2? Let's see. So let's see. So here are a few photos of my birthday celebration. We are practicing drunken boy band choreography. I was turning 36. I remember that Joanne prepared homemade salsa fresca that day. We sat around a large shaded table with a bottle of tequila or
Mezcal.
Mezcal, yeah. A bottle of tequila in the center, working on collaborations. These were full color, take your time kinds of affairs, colored pencil and then outlining in bright marker. It was a lot of fun, but certainly that did not mean that Joanne wasn't being critical of anything you might put down. I remember how much she disliked a pair of red lips with stars over the front teeth that I drew. Disappointing her was really entertaining, though. It was sort of the point, like having a guru, the possibility of recalibration, insult as illumination. Once I disappointed her during a sumi ink and brush session after lunch in Bolinas. She peeked over my shoulder and shouted, "Oh, ick." I promise you these are very fond memories of her. Okay, can you show image 3? Image 3. So this image is actually, I couldn't find the actual collaboration with the stars over the teeth, but this is a card that Joanne and Donald sent to me, and you'll get the sense of what our collaborations were like. It was sort of us following that visual lead. This was something they sent me for my 29th birthday. They would always do these incredibly disarming, endearing things, like take hours to make you a postcard. But I just wanted to show that as a visual representation of what our collaborations often looked like. But back to Mexico, I am remembering all the portable shrines she set up around their sublet in Oaxaca. One for Philip Whalen, A silver mirror placed behind his smiling photo, his ring sitting in a dish before lighted incense, Japanese incense, and a tiny candle. There were other tiny altars present too. She and Donald always made any temporary space their own while traveling. It reminds me of something she always said to me. It is not what you write as a poet, but how you live as a poet. And she always was telling me that, the further you get into it, those two things become inextricable. It becomes one power. And I wanted to read two poems that she wrote in Oaxaca from her incredible chapbook called God Never Dies. And there's a little intro, a little note about Oaxaca at the beginning. And this was published in 2005. This is the little note at the beginning of God Never Dies, Poems from Oaxaca. The Oaxaca composer Macedonia Alcala wrote a very famous waltz titled Dios Nunca Muere, God Never Dies. It is known as the Hymn of Oaxaca. We lived on the street named after him. Macedonia Alcala was born on August 24th, 1869 in Oaxaca, in a building that is now an ice cream parlor called Hawaiian Paradise. And we went to that ice cream parlor, of course. Okay. The morning and evening, red-headed finch pronounces a very busy territorial explanation of his vested being. The droopy spider plant tries harder to perk up with a cup of water. Stroke of brush in painting, pitch of tone in writing. Here in Oaxaca, it's the night of the radishes. Now I wave from the green balcony above the gardenia. In my shoes without socks, the sun is frankly generous today when everyone needs room at the inn. Time to put the Buddha back in place. He doesn't mind being Catholic in Mexico. Part of the long preliminaries of the day's preparation for carving through the red skin. And that's dated December 23rd, Tuesday, 2004. The greatest moment of our trip together, Joanne and Donald were not even aware of. I never told them this. We had arrived in Oaxaca the night before they did, and they had to stay in a local hotel for one night before their sublet was available. And they had mentioned this to us. One night, it was late, as I recall, Brian and I were walking quickly through downtown Oaxaca. We stopped for a second in front of a large hotel and could suddenly see Donald and Joanne walking up the path to the entrance. Donald was holding a large door open for Joanne. They couldn't see us. The streets were dark and we were standing back in the shadows. It was incredible to reverse the glamour of the inner circle, to be at a sudden and illuminating distance. Her objective mythology was outlined in full effect. We never mentioned that we saw them checking in that night. This is brand new information. I thought of Kevin Killian and how he would have appreciated this instance of transfiguring time, how it revealed our first possible steps back into romance, the legend, the gossip, the velvet patterned door that secretly sticks. She invited us back through time and time again. Looking back, it is indeed difficult to track a waterfall of affection. And I just wanted to mention other books by Joanne that take place entirely in Mexico. Pátzcuaro Journal, which was published, I believe, in 1996 by Duncan McNaughton. God Never Dies, which I just read from, that was published by Kevin Opstedal in 2005. And these are just pamphlets. And then my personal favorite, Phenomenology, which was a journal of a trip she took to the Yucatan in the 90s. And she's also worried, there's also the AIDS crisis enters into that because she's worried about her friends that are dying in San Francisco and has some kind of communication with them when she's in Mexico, I believe. I can't remember the pyramid she's visiting. Anyway, that's a great one. And that's part of I always forget the name of it. Anyway, it was published out of Buffalo. And also there's Not Veracruz, which is a journal that she wrote. I think this was early 2000s, mid 2000s, but she was expecting to go to Veracruz and something happened. I think Donald may have hurt his back and suddenly it became impossible to go to Veracruz. And so she ended up just writing a book at home and titling it Not Veracruz. So even her longing for Mexico constituted a book. And here I wanted to read just a statement that Joanne made about her own writing from December 2005. So she can have her own say about her poetics. And I dated some of these. I wrote this piece over several days. It was almost like a critical day book. I thought dating seemed important because it was Joanne, even if I wasn't writing poetry. So this was dated May 19th. But this is her speaking first. The shape of the day, the words of the moment, what's happening around me in the world of interior and exterior space. These are my writing concerns. Living in a semi-rural environment, the cast of characters in my poems are often the quail, deer, raccoons, coyote bush, oaks, the ocean, the weather, and a few treasured friends. All are equally valid in the environment of space. Some talk more than others. My attention to writing is a daily practice, which then builds to an accumulative narrative of chronology, which ends up as the story of one's life, a historical sense of self, breathing and experiencing what is common to every human, the local, the ordinary, the non-motivated sense of just being. One is also aware of the accumulations of lineage of all those writing persons who have come before, and to whom one owes the inheritance of this written moment. December 2005. And I wanted to address, what effect Joanne's work has had on my own writing. We were sort of opposites in terms of the way we approach the poem. For Joanne, I think the gesture of dating would often open the door to composition, whereas for me, dating seemed to drain the excitement away from writing when I was first starting out. It felt too even-handed that anything could be counted as content. Of course, I was totally missing her point. She was offering just a glimpse of paradise, presenting the possibility of leaving the door open to the poem over several days. This would be composition in the manner of Jack Spicer's serial poetics, and this comes directly from his letter to Robin Blazer at the end of Admonitions. Quote, "There really is no single poem. Poems should echo and re-echo against each other. They should create resonances. They cannot live alone any more than we can. Things fit together. We knew that. It is the principle of magic. Two inconsequential things can combine together to become a consequence. This is true of poems too." And I may have wanted to believe this, but Joanne and I were sort of living in two different time signatures. I was always rushing to scribble something down between my day job and rushing off to a reading or party or God knows what. Joanne rose to meet the poem daily, was willing to record acutely the way it was unfolding for her. She created a household in Bolinas where this view would be consistently available. That part of her approach reminds me of Robert Duncan and the sanctity of the household and its underpinning architecture. And here, this is from Duncan's poem, Passages 9, The Architecture. I feel like I should give equal time to Duncan and Spicer. It must have recesses. There is a great charm in a room broken up in plan, where that slight feeling of mystery is given to it, which arises when you cannot see the whole room from any one place, when there is always something around the corner. From the window shelter, the light, the curtains of daffodil yellow, light beyond a little night music, afternoon strains of mahogany on the phonograph, distant intoxications of brazen crisis. Joanne described my own work back to me as very touch and go. It's true that I have never required a sense of grounding in order to begin to write a poem. Now I see she was trying to get me to realize that there is always content to be had, both high and low, that data surrounds us and is asking to be represented as words. Even if the gesture of dating did feel too democratizing, why not just try it to shift your handle on the material of the poem? I think I became much more restless and excited a writer after learning to let go in this way that she suggested. Joanne seemed to indicate that her best poems occurred when she literally forgot she was writing something called poetry. She would trick me into doing more writing by saying I should just write 3 lines and, quote, not even think about it, or just, quote, just write down what books you are reading and their authors, knowing that this would lead to further and further accumulations of language. Joanne had achieved this uncanny scramble to her poetic line that was then set off and enhanced by the warm inflection of her speaking/reading voice. We read together in 2015 at Moe's in Berkeley, and she called me up the next morning to gossip about the reading and the party afterward at Coulter and Larry's. She complimented my reading, saying that I was very good and just so succinct, and that I obviously just did not want to make one single mistake. She was right, which I had thought was what I had thought was the best approach to reading was in fact the most fear-based and distancing approach. You sometimes want the sudden inflection and space of interruption that mistakes can bring, the warp and active shadow of chance hovering over the act, wind giving presence to fragments, as Ted Berrigan once wrote. I attempted to describe Joanne's reading style in the introduction to There You Are. That night, the titles of her poems were whispered or spoken from afar. It was as if the interruption of the titles might break down the hushed, intimate tones that her voice was intent on forming. This gesture felt disarming in its simplicity, an opening out from the center with a sudden pause built in. I began to realize over the course of this reading that the discipline of the practice itself secures her architecture. Joanne's poetry is not so dependent on good or bad lines, but upon the vantage point that she starts from. Okay, can we play the recording of Joanne reading? This is a poem titled Still from a reading in 1976 at Intersection for the Arts. I don't think it's in any book. I couldn't find it.
Still, our breath, our sun, our moon, our stars, our space, our water that flows out of the mountains, our ocean, our roads, our paths, and into this year and into the next, into the warm gray day, damp smells rising up out of the earth. See, we can learn to move gracefully through this past learning. This is a dream about 2 sources of image and language, about strength and ease, green tips at our fingers pointing to the sky. In the sun, in the mist, on the hill across, I remember spring, now in summer, in sun petals. The quick grass brings back a vehicle for what passes through, not for identity of eyes and sorrows. Struck by the humility total of truth, listening to separate existence of world mist on a hill across, I remember spring, now in summer, in sun petals. The quick grass brings back a vehicle for what passes through, not for identity of eyes and sorrows. Struck by the humility total of truth, listening to separate existence of worlds since I was born, to look at the substance of what passes by the eyes, sparkling in pages of notes of music, and remain in memory as renewal, as voices from out on the water, as craft that carries this voyager forward, back out of time is this moment when I write to you these notes of myself.
Wow. Okay. So Joanne passed away 5 years ago now. And within that length of time, one becomes desperate for even perceived communication. I believe that this communication is often offered through another dimension, nature being the most obvious portal. Eagles and osprey passing close overhead, light that is kept quivering through fir branches or dry pine, or the same dissolving sun on the surface of the Willamette River as a train is pulling out over a steel bridge. This was in Portland last year. The light moved along with the gait of a human voice, a rhyming and yarn of resemblance that occurred in silence. It's as if I could hear that first hesitancy that hooks us onto Joanne's voice, like the first bent note of a poem out loud and moving forward. We have communicated not only through projections of light, but also through transcription of her experimental video work. This is a transcription of the language from one of the films we showed at the beginning. I literally copied the language in order as it occurred within the film. I'll just read that. Once upon a time, I was speaking and he was speaking and the poem was speaking. Thank you for the ground it gives us a place to be. I was speaking and you were speaking and the poem was speaking. Gives us a place to be. Thank you for the ground it gives us. So I took this as a thank you, for my work on our interview book. There you are. It gives us a place to be together. We have also communicated through timing, through incidents of travel in poetry. I quote, accidentally visited Bolinas on March 11th, 2018, 1 year to the day of her death. And at that precise moment of her passing, 11:11 a.m., I was writing about her in the Hermit Hut, one of the guest houses on her property. And this is that poem. It's titled Cold Valley. And this comes from a book called On the Way, published by Michael Slozik, and he gathered all my Joanne-related poetry and made it into a book for me. Cold Valley. The fog shades a smooth stone bust, then slips into rain. My mind is well suited, onyx, shining edges, the reflection itself. Traces of mist on an old window. The best part is grinding the ink down endlessly, filling my brush. Gray morning. I first feel the mind as reflex. Bright and clear, the end of Evergreen Road is closed and crumbling away. Bill McNeil's red poppy resolves to be eaten alive, exposed to a shaft of air between the flower and its flat glass, masterful. The black bleeds out from his beak in long tears, ink onto sopping head feathers, slicked back, black stitches on yellow, powdered eyes aglow, white speckles thrown onto autumn breast feathers, a white field below. Excuse me. So, and finally, we have also communicated through dreams. Here is a bit from a week-long journal entitled Surface Waves. And this is in my book, On the Way. It's just one line. She comes riding around the corner. She is fine, in fact, elated, just trying to come down after tracking life up to the minute at her leisure. So really, I guess I am saying that poetry can present all kinds of passageways of communication beyond this realm, but the glimpses we get into these active portals can be fleeting, one time only sort of hookups. It's nice to make some claims of poetry that are somewhat mystical. So often we move outward only from our heads, our intelligence. And I wanted to read one last poem by Joanne. from the 90s, from her book Again, because it contains some of my favorite lines she ever wrote. The quest is to find those lost, vibrating overtones of the poetry stone. So here's this poem. It's titled Terrace Road Slumps into the Canyon. Just one access to the mesa now, with a night stew of Emerson until midnight. Mist, light drizzle, and water-laden sky turns into downpour over pastures of ghosts and morning woods of angels. Does a place have its own memory? I'm on the river and cut off by the flood. What is free from cause and effect? The poetry song stone that gives off overtones. The quest is to find those lost vibrating overtones of the poetry stone. Along the trail of your little town, sheltered since your birth, the beautiful land, intense nostalgia invades my soul. Carrying Ita all night, protecting that warm old cat body in my arms to get her to a place of respite, comfort, and safety. God makes an impenetrable screen of pure sky, pulsating, undulating, casual. January 1995. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cedar.
Cool, I can see everyone again here.
Now we're gonna open up the space for conversation and questions, and feel free to unmute if you feel comfortable and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat. Thank you so much, Cedar.
Oh, sure. God. Whoa, hi, Ajit. Wow, look at all these people. Finally seeing who's here. Oh, hi, Heidi. I'm glad we were able to include the films and the recording and the pictures. I like the whole multimedia aspect of that.
Oh, I have a question.
Okay.
But it's not fully formulated in any way, but just bouncing off of one thing that I caught you saying about the how her work is not so much about the lines, but her vantage. I wondered if you would talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I think it's just very much about her approach. Like I was saying, kind of leaving the door open, or finding your way into the poem by saying, well, I'm just going to write five lines, to kind of lowering the bar initially, as opposed to poetry being considered this marbleized Gothic cathedral that must be, weighting the whole body. And I was resistant to that because I thought, well, it's just, I only have this amount of time to write the poem, and I want to write a poem, and I want to make an object. That was very to the front of my mind, to make words into a three-dimensional object. Whereas Joanne's thing, it was like, oh, maybe come through what, let the light beckon you through this door and just write what first comes to mind. Her another thing she always used to tell me was that poetry was almost like pastry dough. Like if you handle it too much, it becomes tough and inoperable, so you only have a few times going into the pool, and then things get tricky. So, but I think it also, when you say that, it also makes me think of when I was in my 20s, and, you think you're this great poet, but really, you just have great intentions. You haven't even made great works, and you're scanning everyone's works for like their worst lines, for their weaknesses. And, it doesn't, there are so many other things that have to do with poetry than just writing good lines and writing a good poem. You become a teacher, you become a mentor, you become an editor, you become a curator. And there's just much bigger than, whipping yourself over a bad line or a cliche. Yeah. Well, I'm interested in why, to me, if I want to be real about this, is to me, when I lived in San Francisco, I felt Joanne was treated largely as sort of a guilty pleasure, among the remnants of the language school. So I'm kind of interested in why people are suddenly interested in her work, So I think that's something I'm interested in, is how, since I left, suddenly her stock has risen. Oh yeah, I think it had something to do with that. Hi. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Lena. Thank you so much for this talk. This is really wonderful. I discovered Joanne Kyger's work, I think in 2018 through Nick Sturm, who does a lot of curation of language school and New York school poets. I'm located in New York, but I've also spent a little bit of time in Bolinas, and actually a lot of my curiosity about going there was reading Joanne's work and reading about the community there. Yeah, I'm also just thinking, I have this book by Andrew Epstein that's called Attention Equals Life. That I think the subtitle is like the poetry of the everyday. And so that's kind of this realm of like attention to everyday life is a really big interest of mine, and is one of the things that really stuck out to me the most about Joanne's work. And she's just been one of my biggest inspirations since 2018. And actually the first event I ever went to at the Poetry Project in New York was her memorial reading.
Oh, cool.
So
yeah, we did see each other.
Yeah. So these are like kind of some of the threads that are connecting me with her, but I just, yeah, I really love her. And I guess, yeah, I'm also just interested in kind of the kind of rise in popularity of Zen Buddhism in the US, like kind of through the beat poets. And I think her writings in the Japan and India Journal were quite interesting about that too. And so I was kind of just curious to hear a little bit more of what you noticed about her specific like routines and rituals on kind of a daily basis around her writing, maybe what kind of like specific, I don't know, times of day or spaces or materials she used. Yeah.
That's a good question. Well, I wish I had a map because her house is so complex. There are so many different, very well-appointed buildings on her property. She had initially her old house in Bolinas, and then when her mother died, she built a studio, which is where she would entertain. It was really like a party house that she built behind the old house. And then she had a little tiny, how would you describe it? Almost like the shape of like an outhouse, not much bigger.
Yeah, like a little storage.
Yeah, it was like a studio. But I think that one she only used during the warm months. It was almost like seasonal. And then in the winter, I think she would build a fire, and this is, I think, and I think she would then work on the computer in the old house. And then the summer months, she would work in the smaller, but when she didn't need a space heater, I think. But the view that you got, of course, wasn't exactly the real view, because she would be spending so much time entertaining you and making sure you were okay, and putting out the good china and making you very elaborate meals. And I'm not overestimating that. I mean,
not at
all. So I was always interested in that too. What goes on when I'm not there? Another thing she would do is kind of deceive you about how many visitors she was getting. She would play it like, oh, I'm up here alone, but you would realize, oh, someone more glamorous than me is coming 2 days from now. So there were sort of illusions that she put up there too. But again, a lot of it was when we would do those collaborations, not all of them were visual. Some of them were just words, and sometimes she would let you see what the other person had written down previously or not. So those were different ways of working when we were together. But one thing I'll say about Joanne was that she would do a lot of writing, daily writing. And then when somebody asked for, 5 poems, or they asked to look at something, then she would type it up, and there were doubts that came with that process. I mean, I remember Donald telling me that not long before she died, like maybe a year before she died, she was sending out like 10 poems for a place to make like a little unfolding brochure of poetry. And the way she laid it down in front of Donald, she was like, is there anything of use here? Is there anything good in this? And for a master, somebody I consider a master poet at 70 to be saying that to their partner, who is often your only and first available reader, I just realized it's always going to be like this. You're always going to want poetry to be, above where it's at right now. And yeah, so just to say that she had, the same kind of doubts, and I always wanted that view, when I wasn't there. Sometimes you would get it better if you went up and stayed alone, and then you stayed a couple days, and you got to see a little bit more what it would be like. But when I came up, it would be a lot of, we would do fun things, like after a while, like the last time I went up, I remember instead of just smoking weed, we smoked opium, at the end. So there were, she would do all kinds of things to make it a new experience. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Oh, hi, Chuck. Yes. So are there other questions, or I don't know what else?
I could try to answer your question, Cedar.
Hi. Oh, hi, Steve.
Steve Benson. That I feel like I don't know if my interest or my parcel or my provision of concern about Joanne has changed over time. It feels as though it's always been the same, but it also that her work has been elusive to me. It sort of disappears in my hands, or as I'm trying to remember anything, it's all gone. But I have still a feeling of the person and a sensibility that is spiritual as well as psychological. And then, but I never got to know her. I never had any of that kind of immersion experience that you describe. And that seems incredibly valuable to me as you speak of it. And so I'm glad to hear about what it was like to know her, to be friends, and to celebrate the occasions of meeting again and again from you. It's really neat.
Thank you. Yeah, another thing that I want to say about her is that, when we met, I had done nothing. I had not published anything. I was kind of writing bad poetry. And every time I would go up there, there was no reason for her to treat me, like royalty. And she did from the very beginning, before I had done anything interesting. I think I had, kind of entertained her by being at Naropa at the same time, but it's not like I was accomplished in any way. And one thing I want to say too about Joanne's style is it does disappear in your hands. It's a good description of her work, especially when you try to write like Joanne Kyger. Many skinned knees have happened when people trying to write like her, because there's a deceptive amount of data on the page. And if you take out one or two things, it just all goes away. Yeah, she set herself. She set up little traps for herself. I saw one of the last poems she ever wrote, and it was different. It was one day. It was like a whole day. It was almost like an itinerary. It'd be like 11:45, and then like a line in quotes, and then there'll be like 12 minutes later another line in quotes. I think this is the last poem she wrote, and Donald showed it to me, and it was different. It was just like checking in all throughout the day with little lines. And there was so much too that we left out of There You Are. That book was only 150 pages. And then if you saw the next book in that series, which was a book about Keith Waldrop, that one was about 300 pages. But I didn't realize I could do that. Anne was insistent too that we not go. But Yeah.
Peter,
Is there anything
thanks
else?
so much. This was really so
Oh,
incredible.
hi, Rob. I know I made sure to invite you. I knew you would love this.
Great. It was so great to hear. Thanks so much. And when you were talking about your discussions with her and hers with you about different ways of entering and continuing the work, it made me wonder if over the years the two of you had any or many discussions about kinds of work, contemporaries, but also from the past, that one or the other of you felt strongly about and the other didn't, and what those conversations were like and how you perhaps found languages to try to offer perspectives on what the other guy couldn't quite see in your own eyes. Anyway, any moments of that would be interesting if they in fact happen. And thanks again, this was really great.
Yeah, well, they happened. I'm not sure how at liberty I am to discuss certain names in that, but we did argue a lot, about things. I remember recently, I just talked to Donald yesterday, and we were talking about disagreements we had, and I said something to the effect of, oh, I remember, fighting about dating the poem and how I thought it was boring and that would excited her. And to be honest, I felt like sometimes I would end up defending some of the later language poets sometimes, just because, I think she got kind of bored with that scene for a long time and was grateful to be in Bolinas while this kind of very theoretical based male dominated, even though there were women there. I think I think she was a little bored with that scene. And so sometimes there would be people that I would think were coming out of that tradition that were great. And so I would have to kind of convince her of that, because it seemed like people were just playing along with these rules of theory and going along with power structures that were made up in the 90s that had little to do with things that were happening in the 2000s. This was just my sense too, as a writer, and being a poor writer and not a white writer and not a straight writer. And, and I think she had also had a sense of feeling, not that important at times in the 90s up in Bolinas, if I'm being honest. So, but I'm not going to say names probably, just because it's such a small scene. Yeah.
Thanks. That's really, really helpful to hear. Thanks. And thanks again, Cedar.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question, if there's still time.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. That was so great. And my question is specifically, it's just really beautiful to see you tracing this relationship past the kind of arbitrary but so significant point of death. And I'm curious, I loved how you kind of touched on how Joanne's work maybe unfolds, or your relationship in dreams that continues. And I'm curious if this relationship in particular, or this kind of practice of keeping this person and her work with you, has if there's any things you can point to in your own work and your relationship with time that changes as you're in ongoing conversation past the point of death.
Well, yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, because you, I was saying, it's sort of based on a possible misinterpretation of stuff that's happening around you, and you want this to be communication with Joanne and all of that. But I think just sharing that, the idea that I'm hoping that that's what this is, that's, to me, that I feel like I'm just kind of getting a handle on translating those things. And then certainly publicly, to say that publicly is odd. I'm kind of glad Donald isn't here, because I think it would almost be odd, for for him to hear me saying, you know, I think she was present in this moment. I think she was present because it sounds so desperate. But I don't know how to. But you know, the thing about Joanne is she was preparing for her death her whole life, like any good Buddhist, you know. And she was. I mean, there's a poem, the very last poem in Places to Go is a poem imagining her own death, imagining her dead body and the crypt closing, and it's very beautiful. Yeah, so I don't know that I want to become a Buddhist, but she certainly, you know, the robe fit very well for her. So I hope that's something. I'm not sure what to say about that.
No, thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Hi, Cedar. I'll jump in for a moment.
Oh, hi.
Great
Yeah.
to see you. Yeah, hope to see you in a couple of weeks out here in Colorado.
Yeah.
I'm actually really amused that you call her a good Buddhist. I bet she thought she was a terrible Buddhist.
She wouldn't even admit to being a Buddhist if you said Buddhist. You know what I mean? That's how difficult it was. She's like, don't call me a Buddhist. You know, it's like, okay, but you write about Buddhism in your poetry all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
A bad sitter. She was a bad meditator, I think, not a bad Buddhist.
Yeah. She has a great poem where she says, all I seem to do anymore is light incense.
Totally.
But I want to go back to something, you know, you're talking about the dating. I once asked her, because I have always been fascinated by her journals. I'd love someday to really have some time to go through them. I guess they're at Jeff Mazur's place in Berkeley until somebody buys them. But
right.
When I asked her about, you know, how she did the journals, she said she always started with the date and the place. And to her, that was a way of sort of answering the questions, where am I and when am I? And that got you out of the Western head trip of who am I?
Oh.
So where and when am I? So that's also her, you know, sort of eco-poetics or, you know, environmental poetics.
Right. And she also said that through Wayland dating his work in that very stodgy way he would date it, was also a sense of saying, you know, I got here first. There was that sense of being an explorer and saying, oh, this is ground I covered, you know, putting the flag into it too. Yeah, I think that's funny that like anything that you would try to if you tried to trap Joanne into any kind of thinking or being a beat even, or being San Francisco Renaissance, she would always get very funny about those labels too. Because people just wanted to have a handle on her because they couldn't have a handle on her. You know what I mean? She was alone. She lived alone. I mean, she lived with her partners, but they lived in seclusion. And anything you would try to nail her down, she would just slip away and be funny about it too, you know. Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about visiting her too. I mean, you stayed in the hermit hut several times. You know?
Yeah, in fact, I stayed there right after you because, you know, a year after her death, I went and stayed there.
I wrote on that thing I wrote, you had written, you know, there was that little notebook in there.
Yeah, the little guest book.
Yeah.
And I saw that you had just stayed there like 2 weeks earlier or something. But yeah, she was, you know, I also want to, you know, I want to point out that like there was an economy to her poetry that also went through her whole life. You know, she seemed to be of a kind of, you know, I don't even know quite how to say it, but she could take the most minimal food items and make the most elegant dinner out of it. You know, a single small chicken and a few snacks she'd picked up free in Chinatown and put them out on the table, and you felt like you had a feast there. I mean, it was really a very particular ethos and training, and I think it goes into her poetry too.
Yeah.
And
remember the rice salad, the sushi rice salad with the peas on top? That was the best. And those were that was 2 ingredients, rice and peas, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah. And probably rice wine vinegar.
And I think this might be one of the reasons, maybe this is one of the reasons her poetry seems so elusive. It's often very, very funny, but you can't think back through the humor, because that's like hearing somebody tell a joke really badly. You know, to tell a joke, it has to be told exactly in order to work. And I think Joanne's poetry works that way. It's funny, but if you try to paraphrase it, it all vanishes on you.
Totally. It's like giving brilliant choreography to a bad dancer. Yeah, like sometimes, you know, it's like, and to read her poetry out loud is very, to do it well is difficult. It has very difficult syncopations, you know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Right. Yeah, good. Yeah, I'll be out. Yes.
Can I piggyback on that question?
Yeah.
And the mention of the dating of the work, it's several times. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit, maybe just to your own poetry and how I'm just reading all this time.
Oh yeah.
And I love when you date your poems, but you don't date all of your poems.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can speak to, clearly that's something that you've gotten from Joanne, but how that decision comes about in your own work, or what strikes you, or do you feel like you're in conversation with her when you do that?
Yeah, I do feel like that. I feel like it's an approach almost like fishing with a pole versus fishing with a net. Like when I'm dating, I'm like fishing with a net. I'm just tossing it out there, and then 2 days later, I'll kind of bring the net in and see what's there, you know. And that's nice. And sometimes I'll have that going, and then I'll do, you know, a standalone successful poem, you know, but while that over those 3 or 4 days, in fact, it's kind of like that sort of exercise, you know, and that's the field. And then other poems occur within that field, you know. One other thing I want to say about Joanne too, is that Joanne, something that meant a lot to me in our early part of our relationship, this doesn't have that much to do with your question, but she had a gig at Bumbershoot, this big music festival in Seattle. And when she did that, like on her day off, she took the ferry over to Suquamish and went to the Suquamish Museum. We had only known each other for like 1.5 years. And she took that time and went over and learned about my history and met my cousins who were working the desk there. And just to say like how she wanted to be close, you know, and she wanted to be closer. And you know, that's a big deal for somebody to go and learn your history and do that. I do like to date my poetry now that I've been in the game so long, you know, and people probably do want to know something about my life, you know, and so then in that way, I started dating it just out of the fact that I've been doing it so long. And what I learned from doing the Joanne book is there's the poetry, which is an autobiography of sorts, especially with her, with the dating, but then there's also, you know, all of her history and her life, and that's the sort of illuminating background for the poetry. So yeah, I found that out doing that book. But I like to date things and I like to not date things. I'm very restless and like to keep myself sort of off balance, you know, and always questioning how to re-enter the poem. So that's why I do dating, and that's why I stop doing it. You know, if it feels too available, then I get bored, you know. Yeah, very touch and go. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think she thought that was an insult, but I always thought it was kind of great. All right. Is there anything else? Let's see.
I guess I'll say one thing.
Hi, Kat.
Hi, how you doing? Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody. Just the first time I met Joanne was probably like 72, and I had just moved to San Francisco and was, you know, hanging out with friends, and we were poets, but we hadn't, I mean, nobody knew that. We hadn't written much. And I don't know how, but we went out to Bolinas and met Joanne. It wasn't at her house. It was, you know, downtown Bolinas or something. And she was amazingly direct and open to us. I felt like she recognized me immediately. Yeah, and
was this with Bill too? Were you with Bill?
No, No, not that day. I don't remember who. I remember who. I was with some friends from San Francisco, but I think there may have been someone else there, but not Bill.
Okay.
But anyway, I mean, I just felt like I knew Joanne from that moment, and she knew me, and it was, and she was always terrific, you know, really great. One time I walked into a bar in San Francisco, and there were some other famous poets there, and then there was just a big crowd. It was probably the 70s, and I just kind of looked around, you know, and then I approached the table where Joanne was sitting with some other poets, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you flash so fast."
Oh my gosh, she was such a flirt. Gosh. One cool thing she did tell me, this reminds me of something she did tell me that's super cool poetry gossip. She said that when Bob Kaufman was in the midst of his vow of silence, she ran into him in North Beach, and he just came up to her right away and said, "Hi, Joanne." And then he moved on. Yeah. But there are a million things that she told me like that. I feel like at certain times I think I could write something like Charles Olson in Connecticut, or an emotional memoir of Franz Klein, but I don't think I will. I think she would hate that, but I realize how much is there now that she's gone, because and then when you get asked to do things like this and you decide to do the personal side, which you had kind of locked off, you know, then all this stuff comes in that could become memoir or God knows what.
Right. The one other thing I wanted to mention is her professionalism as a poet.
Yeah.
Like if you went to a reading by Joanne, you knew that it wasn't going to go past a half hour, and that she was going to be completely on the whole time, and relaxed and
funny.
She was perfect as a reader, you know, of her own work.
It's funny that the Beats in general have this reputation for being, you know, disorganized, druggy, this, that, and the third. I never met anybody more sort of responsible and conservative in certain ways, like with money, you know. So a lot of the projections that people make about the Beats and all of that, a lot of these people were, you know, devout Buddhists and meditators, and had to be very careful with their money, and had to be, in order to survive as poets. So they were only as wild as they kind of could be, you know. I think that's important to say too. She was very responsible.
I was very interested in your comments about Mexico, and also the outtakes from the collaboration she did with KQED, the Descartes project, which I've been trying to write about myself lately. And I found it very fascinating the way she makes this film about Descartes, but sort of deconstructs him and, you know, completely undoes him in a very witty way. So I was interested that you showed these outtakes, which I didn't know existed, about how she was, I guess they turned these people loose in the studios, and they didn't particularly have a lot of experience doing films. And that's a fascinating thing that she produced, I thought.
Absolutely. And people forget that that her minor at Santa Barbara was philosophy. So she was well versed in Descartes by the time she started manipulating that text. I thank you so much for your event at City Lights. You know, I attended that, and
yeah, thank you. Well, I didn't know you had been to Mexico with her, so that's
actually, you did your whole thing about Mexico. So I needed your book for this talk. Yeah.
No, on the reverse, because that's how you asked about our interest in Kyger, and that's when I started researching the Beats in Mexico. I hadn't realized that she had been there so frequently.
Yeah.
And so that was very interesting to find that out.
Yeah. I want to write about Margaret next. So yeah. Anyway, well,
thank you.
Is there anything else?
Yeah, I was gonna say if there are any other final questions, but thank you so much, Cedar. This was really just so moving, and there's just so much. I really appreciate that you brought the personal and intimate connection.
Well, I would only do it for you guys. I feel like I'm in someone's living room in San Francisco, which is my favorite place to be for poetry. So, yeah.
Thank you again. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yes.
Like Madeline said, we will take a break for the summer, but we'll be back in the fall. So keep an eye out for new stuff then. But until then, enjoy your summer, everyone, and be well.
Bye. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Miss you. Bye.